Picture this, a beautiful July morning in the Colorado Rockies. The kind of day that makes you want to grab your hiking boots and hit the trail. For 32-year-old Sarah Brennan, it was supposed to be just another adventure with her 2-year-old son, Ethan. A routine morning hike, the kind they did all the time. But when the sun set that day, neither Sarah nor Ethan ever came home. This wasn't some risky backcountry expedition. They were sticking to well-marked trails they'd hiked dozens of times before. Sarah wasn't just any hiker, she was the kind who checked the weather obsessively, packed extra supplies, and always signed the trail register. She'd convinced her husband Mark to move from Ohio to Colorado for the mountains, and even after Ethan was born, she kept up her hiking routine, just modified for a toddler in a carrier. So when they vanished on what should have been the easiest, safest hike, it didn't make sense. Rangers searched for days, then weeks, then months, but they found absolutely nothing. No bodies, no clues, no trace whatsoever of what happened to this young mother and her little boy. For 6 long years, Mark Brennan lived in limbo. How do you grieve for someone who just disappeared? How do you explain to friends that your wife and child are just ... gone? He kept their photos up, maintained their home, and never stopped hoping they'd walk through the door. Neighbors stopped asking. The world moved on. But Mark couldn't. He replayed that morning over and over. He'd been sick with food poisoning, and insisted they go without him. What if he'd gone? What if he'd been the one to notice something was wrong? Then, out of nowhere, a phone call. 6 years later, Detective Patricia Chen from the Park County Sheriff's Office needed to speak with him immediately. Her voice was careful, professional, but Mark could hear the weight behind her words. A research team studying hot springs had made a discovery that would change everything. They'd found Sarah's remains in Morning Glory Pool, a beautiful but deadly hot spring they'd visited as a family just the summer before. The items they recovered told a story that was almost too horrifying to believe. Sarah had entered that 160-degree spring fully clothed, with all her hiking gear. This wasn't an accident. Something terrible had happened. But here's where it gets even more chilling. Along with Sarah's remains, they found something else that raised a question that would haunt everyone involved. Where was Ethan? If Sarah had died in that boiling pool, what happened to a 2-year-old child? The absence of any evidence of a toddler was almost as disturbing as the discovery of his mother's body. Had he wandered off? Had someone taken him? Or was he? Mark couldn't even finish the thought. The investigation reopened with a vengeance. Detective Chen and her team started pulling together every piece of evidence from 6 years ago. But they also started looking in a completely new direction. Because the more they dug, the more it looked like this wasn't just a tragic accident, or even a random crime. Someone had deliberately hidden Sarah's body in that hot spring. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and where to put a body so it would never be found. The discovery of Sarah's personal items, her hiking gear, her boots, even her wedding ring, suggested this was personal, intimate. Even when they finally identified a suspect, it wasn't who anyone expected. In fact, it was someone who had been helping with the investigation from the very beginning, someone Mark had trusted, someone who claimed to remember Sarah from the trail registers, someone who knew every shelter, every hidden path, every place where a body could disappear forever. The betrayal ran so deep that even now, years later, locals who worked the case still get chills talking about it. But the real question that kept Mark awake at night wasn't who killed his wife. It was whether his son was still alive somewhere, whether that little boy who called him daddy was out there, and if so, what kind of life had been stolen from both of them. Because while they'd found Sarah's remains, they'd found something else too, evidence that pointed to a much bigger, more sinister conspiracy that went far beyond one mother's tragic death in the mountains. The discovery of Sarah's remains sent shockwaves through the small mountain community. Locals who had long ago stopped talking about the mysterious disappearance found themselves haunted by memories. Morning Glory Pool, once a popular photo stop for tourists, became a place people avoided, its brilliant colors now seeming sinister. Under the Colorado sun, Detective Chen threw every resource she had into the reopened investigation. The forensic team worked tirelessly, pulling every possible clue from the extreme environment of the hot spring. The condition of Sarah's remains, while horrific, told a story that was becoming clearer. This was no accident. The evidence pointed to a deliberate act, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Mark Brennan, meanwhile, was living a nightmare. He couldn't wake up from standing by the edge of that deadly pool where his wife's body had been hidden for 6 years. He struggled to reconcile the cheerful family photos on his wall with the reality of how Sarah had died. The detective's careful words about the nature of hot springs couldn't mask the obvious truth. Sarah had entered that 160-degree water fully clothed, with all her hiking gear. This wasn't a slip, wasn't a fall. Someone had put her there. But the real question that kept him awake at night wasn't who killed his wife. It was whether his son was still alive somewhere. Whether that little boy who called him daddy was out there. And if so, what kind of life had been stolen from both of them? The investigation took a dramatic turn when they started looking into who had access to that remote location. The list was short. Park employees, researchers, maybe a few locals who knew the backcountry trails. Detective Chen began methodically checking backgrounds, and that's when they found the first break. A research team member remembered seeing someone acting suspiciously near the hot springs area about a year after Sarah's disappearance. The description was vague, but it was enough to start pulling security footage from nearby trail cameras. What they found made the blood run cold. A figure in Park Service clothing, moving through the area at odd hours, someone who clearly knew the trails well enough to avoid the main camera zones. But the real shock came when they checked the old employee locker assignments. In a locker that had been sealed for years, they found Sarah's personal items, her jewelry, her backup wedding ring, things that had been missing since the day she vanished. The locker belonged to a young seasonal worker named Jake Morrison, a quiet guy who had left his job abruptly and disappeared without a trace. When they dug into Morrison's background, they found a pattern that sent chills through the investigation team. He had requested that specific work assignment, maintenance, on the very trail where Sarah and Ethan had vanished. He had traded shifts with another worker specifically to be on that route that day. It looked like the break they had been hoping for. A suspect who fit the crime perfectly, the Morrison lead seemed to be exactly what they needed. Here was a young man with access to the area, knowledge of the trails, and a sudden disappearance that reeked of guilt. He was the perfect suspect, young enough to raise a child, desperate enough to steal one, quiet enough that no one would notice if he suddenly had a toddler in his life. Detective Chen put out an all-points bulletin, and within days, Morrison was arrested in a small town in Utah, living under an assumed name with a child who looked remarkably like little Ethan Brennan. The media frenzy was immediate, and everyone assumed the case was solved. But Mark Brennan wasn't convinced. Something about the whole thing felt too neat, too convenient. Morrison was arrested, sure, but the man they caught seemed almost relieved to be found, like he was tired of running, and there were details that didn't add up. Why would someone who had allegedly kidnapped a toddler keep the mother's jewelry for 6 years, then hide it in a locker where it could eventually be discovered? Why not just get rid of it when he disappeared? These questions nagged at Mark, keeping him awake during the long nights in his hotel room, staring at the mountains that had taken his family. The doubts really started when Mark began reviewing the original investigation files. There were gaps, inconsistencies that the initial investigators had either missed or chosen to ignore. The trail register showed Sarah had signed in alone that morning. No mention of meeting anyone on the trail, no reports from other hikers of seeing her with a stranger. And there was something else that bothered him, something Ranger Tom Mitchell had said during their search of the shelter cabins. The experienced ranger had talked about the shelters like he knew every detail, every maintenance issue, every hiker who had ever stayed there. But when Mark dug deeper into Mitchell's background, he found something that made his skin crawl. The ranger had been working that exact area on the day Sarah disappeared, supposedly doing maintenance on the very shelters where she might have sought refuge from an unexpected storm. The pieces started falling into place like a nightmare. Mitchell had been everywhere during the investigation, helpful to a fault, volunteering information, staying late to assist with searches. He knew the trails, knew the shelters, knew exactly where to hide a body, where it would never be found. And he had been the one to suggest checking the old employee lockers, leading them directly to Morrison. It was too perfect, too convenient. Mark realized with growing horror that they might have been looking in the wrong direction entirely, focusing on a convenient scapegoat while the real monster had been hiding in plain sight, wearing the uniform of someone trusted to protect visitors to these very mountains. When Mark tried to share his concerns with Detective Chen, she listened politely but seemed convinced that Morrison was their man. After all, they had the suspect in custody, the child who matched Ethan's description, and a confession that tied everything together. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He started doing his own investigation, following up on details that didn't make sense, checking timelines that seemed off. The more he dug, the more he realized that the neat solution they had found was perhaps too neat, and that the real truth might be far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The question was whether he could prove it before it was too late, before the real perpetrator disappeared back into the mountains, where he had learned to hide so well. The days blurred together in a haze of court appearances, interviews, and endless questions from well-meaning friends and strangers alike. The media circus eventually died down, but the echoes of that July morning 6 years ago still haunted the mountain town. Morning Glory Pool, once a popular tourist destination, was now cordoned off indefinitely, its brilliant colors a constant reminder of the tragedy hidden beneath. Mark found himself avoiding the peaks he once loved, unable to look at any hot spring without remembering. Ethan's adjustment was slow and painful. The boy, now legally back under Mark's guardianship, struggled with nightmares and an almost desperate need to reconcile the only life he remembered with the truth of how it began. Therapy sessions were frequent, and Dr. Martinez became a constant presence, helping both Mark and Ethan navigate the treacherous waters of stolen identity and fractured family bonds. The hardest part wasn't just accepting that Tom and Rebecca Mitchell weren't his real parents. It was grappling with the knowledge that they had murdered his mother to keep him. They really loved me, though, didn't they? Ethan asked one evening, almost 3 months after his rescue. They were sitting on the porch of Mark's new, smaller house on the outskirts of town. He'd sold the old place, too many memories tied to Sarah's absence, and moved somewhere quieter, hoping for a fresh start. The question caught Mark off guard, as it often did. Love built on a foundation of lies and murder was still a confusing concept for an 8-year-old. I think they convinced themselves they did, Mark replied carefully, watching his son kick at the dust on the porch floor. They wanted to be parents so badly that they thought the end justified the means. But real love, the kind your mom and I had, doesn't hurt innocent people. It doesn't steal children or kill mothers. Ethan nodded, slowly, but Mark could see the conflict in his eyes. The Mitchells had been his whole world for 6 years. Replacing that with the reality of their crimes was a burden no child should carry. Detective Chen visited often, bringing updates from the investigation and occasionally just checking in. The trial was set for the following spring. Both Tom and Rebecca Mitchell had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. A defense that infuriated Mark, but one their expensive lawyers were pushing hard. The psychiatric evaluations painted a disturbing picture. Rebecca's postpartum depression and subsequent delusions had convinced her that kidnapping Ethan was an act of salvation. Tom, initially portrayed as the sole perpetrator, now shared the diagnosis, his lawyers arguing that prolonged exposure to his wife's mental illness had affected his judgment. It was a twisted narrative, but one that might sway a jury unused to the calculated nature of their crimes. They're monsters, Mark said flatly to Chen during one of her visits. Calling them mentally ill doesn't change the fact that they planned this for years, covered their tracks meticulously, and even killed another person to protect their lie. I know, Chen agreed, sipping her coffee. But the legal system sees it differently sometimes, especially when the crime is this, unusual. The prosecution is pushing for the maximum sentence, but we need to prepare for the possibility of a lesser charge. Sticking, the possibility that the Mitchells might not spend the rest of their lives behind bars was a constant, not in Mark's stomach. They had taken everything from him, his wife, 6 years with his son, his peace of mind. The idea that they might, one day be free, even in a psychiatric facility, felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory. Months passed. Ethan slowly began to call Mark Dad more consistently, though the transition was far from smooth. There were setbacks, angry outbursts directed at both Mark and the therapists, and moments of heartbreaking confusion where Ethan would ask when he could visit Mom, Rebecca. The boy's therapist explained it was normal, a coping mechanism for the trauma, but it felt like a knife twist to Mark every time. Then, just 2 weeks before the trial, everything changed. A routine evidence review turned up something hidden in the sealed files from the original investigation into Sarah's disappearance. Detective Chen called Mark with the news, her voice tight with controlled excitement. We found the dashcam footage from a Park Service vehicle doing a routine patrol the day after Sarah vanished. It was never properly logged. The video shows Tom Mitchell's truck parked at the Avalanche Creek shelter at dusk on July 15th. He was supposed to be miles away, on the other side of the mountain doing maintenance. When we pulled the cell tower pings, his phone was pinging from that exact location. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, so he lied about his whereabouts to the original investigators too. Worse, the timestamp on the dashcam puts him at the shelter, right around the time Sarah would have arrived, seeking shelter from the storm. It's not just evidence of his presence, Mark, it's proof he lied under oath to the police about his schedule. Perjury. In addition to everything else, the new evidence was a game changer. The prosecution added perjury and obstruction of justice charges, which not only strengthened their case but also shattered the defense's narrative of mental instability. A person capable of such calculated deception over years wasn't simply mentally ill. They were predators who had manipulated the system from the beginning. The trial was swift and merciless. The dashcam footage, combined with the physical evidence from the locker, the confession Mitchell had given at the cabin, and the testimony of the hiker who had witnessed Rebecca pushing the other victim, painted an undeniable picture. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The judge, visibly shaken by the details of the case, sentenced Tom and Rebecca Mitchell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Standing in the courtroom that day, watching the Mitchells being led away in handcuffs, Mark felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Sarah back or erase the 6 years Ethan had lost. It couldn't undo the trauma or the complex web of lies that had shaped his son's early life. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan tugged on Mark's hand. "Are they really never coming back?" he asked, his voice small. "No, buddy," Mark said, kneeling down to his son's level. "They're going away for a very long time. And we're going to start figuring out what our life looks like now, just you and me." Ethan nodded, then surprised Mark by hugging him tightly. It was the first time the boy had initiated physical contact since his rescue. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Mark realized that while the trial's end marked the conclusion of one chapter, their real journey as father and son was just beginning. The mountains still loomed overhead, beautiful and terrible in their indifference. But for the first time in years, Mark felt like he could face them again.